Hello, everyone. We're very happy to be joining you in Portland, but actually, for those of you who have sharp eyes, can discern that we're coming from Ananda Village's Temple of Light.
And we're so happy to be in the beautiful city of roses, city of divine blessings. And let's hope that our time together throughout this celebration of Master's 100th anniversary of coming to the West will bring hope and light and peace to your beautiful city.
As you may very well know, Master visited Portland quite often. During the times that he was traveling, he would visit the major cities around the country, and Portland being one of those major cities, he visited quite often. He had a very significant event happen in Portland at the Multnomah Hotel, which I think he used regularly for classes that he gave. For the first time ever, he did public healing prayers where there were healing affirmations that people repeated with him. And that was, I don't know, 1925, 1926, but early on in his travels. And so since that time, for nearly 100 years now, we have been following that pattern. So Master's 100th birthday, or 100th anniversary, I should say, of his coming to America is significant for so many reasons. But I want to touch especially today on how the significance really pertains to exactly the times that we find ourselves in. You know, Master was sent by the great masters of this path, the Babaji and Christ and his line of gurus, but he was sent because Babaji and Christ, who are in charge of, one might say, governing the world on a spiritual level, were looking ahead to the advent of Dwapara Yuga, and they saw the restlessness that was going to be here, the busyness. They saw also the difficulties that would come because of sectarian differences and racial divides. And so Ananda and this path were dedicated to yoga, which means union. In this case, it means union with God. But in a certain sense, what I want to touch on in terms of Master's mission to the West is how he brought a message of unity in a multiple of different ways. I want to start by reading a beautiful prayer from Metaphysical Meditations. This is a prayer that Devi and I, or Devi specifically, read at the United Nations when we accepted our award as Global Peace Ambassadors. And we each gave a small address at that time. And she ended with these words because it talks about the, one might say, mission of the United Nations, but broader than any organization. It talks about the need for unity in the world. So let me read this beautiful prayer of Master's. Prayer for a united world. May the heads of all countries and races be guided to understand that men of all nations are physically and spiritually one. Physically one, because we are the descendants of common parents, the symbolic Adam and Eve, and spiritually one, because we are the immortal children of our Father, bound by eternal links of brotherhood. Let us pray in our hearts for a league of souls and a united world, though we may seem divided by race, creed, color, class, and political prejudices. Still, as children of the one God, we are able in our souls to feel brotherhood and world unity. May we work for the creation of a united world in which every nation will be a useful part, guided by God through man's enlightened consciousness. In our hearts, we can all learn to be free from hate and selfishness. Let us pray for harmony among the nations, that they march hand in hand through the gate of a fair, new civilization. Isn't that beautiful? And how absolutely pertinent it is in today's world. We find ourselves, at least for me, and I've been on this planet almost 8 decades now, we find ourselves in a time of unprecedented division and anger and separation. And it certainly plays out in our country, United States, but it also plays out throughout the world. And so the great masters are bringing to us a message. Yogananda's message that he brought was one of unity on multiple different levels. And it's so important for all of us to hear that message of unity, to hear that all men are created equal under one God, as our Constitution says, to hear the message that we need to knit this world together. It is almost as if Master came 100 years ago, but his message has never been more pertinent and more needed than it is in the world today. Let me talk a little bit about his message of unity. Here he talked about, obviously, the unity that will come about by seeing all men, all races, all religions, all groups of people as children of our one Father. Well, honestly, we can't do that. We can't see unity until we move the needle of our own consciousness toward unity. That's why he also brought the teachings of meditation, of Hong Sa, of pranayama, of energization. He brought many, many teachings, all of which are meant to lift our consciousness. And as our consciousness lifts, we will begin to see unity where before we could only see diversity. We will begin to see brotherhood where before we could only see us and them, and that we have to somehow push out them or get rid of them. That is the sickness of our age. Master, in many ways, brought medication through meditation. Medication for a very sick society, a society that may be prosperous, may be wealthy, may be unprecedentedly able to get things and find things and have a materially, a comfortable life. But that underneath that surface is sick and is in need of spiritual healing. Gandhi is quoted as saying amusingly, as Gandhi often did, when someone asked him, "What do you think of Western culture and Western society?" And Gandhi said, "I think it would be a good idea," meaning that we didn't have much culture, we didn't have much elevation of consciousness. And so the message of Master is first and foremost to help us elevate our consciousness. And with that elevated consciousness, then to apply it to the world. There's a beautiful shloka in the Bhagavad Gita which in which Krishna tells Arjuna, being seated in yoga, then go forth and act properly in the world. Yoga, of course, is union. Having your consciousness raised, then go forth and act properly in the world. And we need, all of us, if we're going to honor Master, other than pay lip service to, oh, he came 100 years ago, isn't that fine? If we're going to really honor him, we need to practice those things which he came to give us as cures to the sickness that society has and that we ourselves carry to a greater or lesser extent. So our first responsibility is to understand, to practice the teachings that he brought us of meditation, of pranayama, of all of our techniques, to practice the right attitudes that lift our consciousness. But there are other ways that he brought a unifying message that are also very, very important in our life. You know, he began his teachings in America, as we're celebrating, 100 years ago. At that time, he began speaking things that even 20 years ago were radical. He began, for instance, saying that the body and the mind are connected, and what we do to the body will affect our mind, the way we think will affect the body. 100 years ago, there was a complete disconnect between body and mind. Now, scientists are understanding that there is a connection, but they still don't, only the kind of fringe, outer, one might say, leading edge of science and medicine understands the importance of consciousness in our physical health, the importance of diet in our physical health. Our physician in the community, Dr. Peter Van Houten, said that when he was in medical school, it was essentially heresy to say that your diet affected your health. There were only a few whispers of the fact that your diet made a difference in your physical well-being. Of course, they knew that if you ate too much starchy food, you might get fat, but they didn't connect it to the immune system, to digestion, to all of the other aspects. Well, India, the India that Master brought, the ancient Vedic sciences, Ayurveda, and so on, long understood these things. It wasn't as if Master was making this up. He was simply bringing the deep ancient teachings of yoga, Ayurveda, Vedic knowledge. He was bringing that to the West, knowing that the time had come for East and West, the teachings of the East to come to the West, the material success and methodology of the West to come to the East, because the time of Dwapara Yuga is a time of balancing those. So balancing East and West, balancing mind and body, balancing diet and health, but not only health. Master also talked specifically about diet and the foods we eat affecting our consciousness. The very first afternoon, the very first day I ever met Swami Kriyananda in 1967, we introduced ourselves, my brother-in-law and I, and it was Easter Sunday in 1967. And Swami, I've told this story, invited us in. Then he said, I'm working on a project. Would you like to help? And I said, of course. And I've joked that I just didn't know that I'd still be working on that project some 55 years later, or 53 years later. So at any rate, that very first afternoon, when we had finished the project, which was a mailing to announce his classes, we went out for a picnic in Golden Gate Park. And at that time, because we were eating a fruit salad, Swami Kriyananda said, charmingly, I was so, I don't know, just touched by him. He was sharing stories of being with Master. And he said, Master said that the fruits that you eat have particular qualities and will help you develop particular qualities. For instance, this banana, and he had a little piece of banana from the fruit salad, said, bananas give us humility. The cherry, held up a cherry, the cherry is for joy, and so on. So in Master's teachings, you see that diet affects the mind, affects the consciousness, in fact, affects the spirit. And why not? Everything ultimately is made of the consciousness of God. Of course it's all interrelated, but we live in a fractured world, and part of our job, part of our mission is to bring together, to knit together that fractured world. Swami Kriyananda used a very nice illustration. He said that when you look at a group of islands in the sea, you see them like your fingers, and each of those fingertips are above the water level, but water is separating them. He said that as that water drains, you see that they're just peaks on one single continent. Well, right now, our fractured world, East and West, mind and body, science and religion, politics, all manner of things are still, the water is draining, and we're still seeing these things as separate. But yoga means unity, and when we drain that water sufficiently, we will see that the unity of man, woman, races, religions, East, West, nations, science, religion, all of these things spring from the one Father, Mother, God, that they all come from the one same consciousness. We, you and I, come from that one consciousness, and that one consciousness unites us all. Master's message, above all, is to connect with God, and in our connection with God, we will connect with each other. God bless you.
Continuing on this theme of celebrating Master's 100th anniversary of beginning his mission, I think it's very important to take this time as we celebrate it. He left India August 3rd on the city of Sparta, and without a friend in the West, with very little money in his pocket. A friend of ours who immigrated to America from Russia actually did, and lives in Boston, did some research in the Boston Maritime Records and found the ship's manifest of all the passengers that were on that city of Sparta. And one of them is Mukunda Lal Ghosh. And it gives a description. It was so charming. It said, any distinguishing marks, scar on his right forearm, if you remember from autobiography, when he had the boil, and he and his sister had the boils and they lanced it. And it said religious affiliation. It said Hindu. It said political affiliation, because the British were very closely watching Indians. He said none, very big, boldly. And then money, $500. And it just was so touching to feel him arriving on the shores alone with $500 in his pocket, barely speaking English. And yet, here we are, 100 years later. That boat docked in Boston Harbor, September 19th, 1920, and this all began. None of us would be here if that great soul had not come to these shores. None of us would be involved with Ananda around the world, in Europe, in Asia, in India, wherever we are, South America, Mexico, throughout North America. And yet we need to understand Master's mission was really unique in the annals of Indian teachers coming to America. I happened to stumble upon, quite by chance, a transcript of a talk that Swamiji gave, and it caught my eye because it said, Swamiji's retirement talk, 1996, Portland. So he gave that talk in the Portland church, but what I had to read it because I thought, 1996, he didn't ever retire, and as we know, he left the body in 2013. So that was 17 years later after he gave his retirement talk. But in that talk, he said, what Master brought was unlike what any Indian teacher or saint brought to the West, because most of, all of their influence, with his exception, was how to go inward, how to withdraw from the world, how to find God within. What Master brought was, Swamiji said in this talk, was how to bring God into daily life. Nobody else had talked about that. And all of his teachings reflect that. But it got me thinking that Master was a transitional, a catalytic influence in the world. And he came 100 years ago, and what did he talk? He lived through the Great Depression, he lived through World War II, the Korean War, and the rise of communism. And so he saw so much suffering, the dropping of the atomic bomb on the cities in Japan. And he spoke of coming hard times, of Great Depression, of global war, all of these things. But he also, his was a transitional message, really meant for these times, I think, more than the times even when he was alive. Or I should say in the body, he's still very much alive. But even in our times, because we need to understand as disciples of Master, or followers of his path, we are part of his carrier wave of helping the world go through these transitional times. And we need to understand that what he brought was not just simply the teachings of meditation and yoga, but without that, we couldn't do any of the rest. That's the core. I don't want to belittle that in any way. Without our practice of energization, meditation, Kriya Yoga, I know for myself, I could not survive right now very well. It's these things that give me my strength and my clarity and my ability to keep in light, keep in joy. But what he brought was he helped pave the way for a shift of consciousness, because in early Dwapara Yuga, as we are, it is a time of shift of consciousness. And without a guide to say, we know where we're coming from, we know we're in confusion now, but we're not quite sure where we're going. He showed us where we're going. And that is in the prayer that Jyotish read. I can't tell you how thrilling it was to read that in the chapel of the United Nations. I just felt we were bringing Master there. He never was in the United Nations. But in any case, what Master brought were tools of helping the world to transition and to transform itself. And we need to understand that this is why he came and why we came to him. I remember when I was a very little girl, I don't remember how old I was, maybe 3 or 4, but I couldn't read yet. But my father had a magazine, and I remember, I don't know if you do, but I have some very vivid moments from my early childhood, probably super conscious, I don't know. But I was looking at just the pictures in this magazine that my father had, and there was a picture of this person. And I couldn't tell if it was a man or a woman, kind of looking slightly at an angle, darkish skin, hair shoulder length. And I couldn't read, so I didn't, it must have been an advertisement for autobiography of a yogi. Obviously, this person was master. I didn't know. I didn't know what the thing said, but I just kept looking at that picture. Is that a man? Is that a woman? Who is this person? And then some 22 years later, someone gave me autobiography of a yogi, and at first I didn't recognize it, but after a while I did. That was the picture that I was so intrigued by. But all of us can tell our stories of how that moment where we saw Master, we read this picture, we read his autobiography, we talked to someone who was on the path already, and it was that the gears started meshing. And so for all of us, we need to understand that we are part of the transition that Master came to bring. We are part of the way showers, the pathfinders, to say, how do we get out of this mess? How do we get out of the entrenched prejudices and greed and divisiveness? And we need to understand what we're seeing now in the world. And this Master also brought hope. Hope, not just saying this will always be bad and forever, but he brought hope that we are moving into a higher age, into a higher level of Dwapara Yuga, I should say. And what we see now, all the tension in the world, and I believe Master said the great pandemic of 1918, the Spanish flu so-called, that was brought about by the negative thoughts generated by the First World War. Well, connecting the dots, I think this pandemic we're in now is brought about by the negative thoughts of humanity right now. Greed and hatred and selfishness and all of these things, violence. And so we need to understand that what Master brought was to show how to move out of this. We have to go through it. But he also said, when he predicted all the catastrophes, and this is important to remember, he said, if enough people turn their consciousness towards God, towards the light, all these looming disasters can be ameliorated, can be lessened. And so we need to think in these terms. What we're seeing is the conflict of the old and the new, the conflict between really Kali Yuga thinking and the energy of Kali Yuga being form. I'm different from you. My religion is different from you. My language and culture separate me from you. And I need to hoard all the money that I can because that's the only thing that's of value. That's Kali Yuga. And what's happening is Kali Yuga and Dwapara are clashing. And we're living in the fallout. But Master showed us. He brought a vision of a fair new civilization, as his closing lines in that prayer. And so we need to understand that what he brought was the way he brought it at the time he lived in this world, but he brought it for anyone who has ears to hear. Let them hear now. We can help bring about the change that Master was the plowshare. He was the one that broke the dry, hard soil, and now we're coming in behind him to help plant seeds of new consciousness. And the other thing, and I'll just close with this, that in this talk that I referred to, Swami's retirement talk that he gave in Portland in your temple there, it was so interesting because he said, well, 1996, I've been serving Master a long time, all since I met him, but now I'm feeling more to go within, not to be so involved in outward work, but to spend the time allotted to me in more inward spiritual focus. And well, what happened? He certainly kept going. In fact, from 1996 till his passing in 2013, he did some of the most important works of his whole life. He wrote the essence of the Gita, the interpretations of the Bible, And I was working on, I believe, Rubaiyat of Omar Khayyam came about that time. But he went to India and started a whole new work in India in 2003 at the age of 77, I believe he was. And so what can we learn from that? Inwardly, Swami was feeling, and he didn't say it very much. I was surprised when I saw that. He was feeling, oh, I've done so much. I'm so tired of all the outward involvement. I would love to spend the rest of my years just being inward and seeking God. But he didn't do that, did he? He kept serving to the last breath he took. And this is what we need to follow his example now. Now's not the time to withdraw. Now's not the time to get discouraged or feel what good does any of it do. We came for a reason. Master came for a world mission that we're only just beginning to discover what it is. And we came to help him, all of us, not just people who lecture, but each of you in your life. How can I further the consciousness that he brought? And this is, in a sense, the beginning of his mission. The beginning, because he came, it wasn't yet time. The world was kind of stable during, even though there were upheavals, but it wasn't yet time for a huge transformation. That time is upon us now. And we need to help him be agents of change and not get discouraged, not get tired, not think, oh, I've done enough. Look at Swamiji. Never stopped. And so, my friends, we're so happy that we're having this time with you to celebrate this great soul who came with a power from God that we can draw on, and yes, be his agent of change, but also help in this incarnation. I think by serving in this way, we will make great spiritual progress, and with God's grace, find God in this lifetime.